I am enjoying it, and there are several parts to the pleasure of being a Phi Beta Kappa speaker. First of all, it's always a pleasure to talk about your work and have comments and reactions from your audience, and that certainly has been happening, and it's been not only a pleasure but also useful. In one case, for instance, I was talking about love and war in the ancient Greek world, and why is love such a part of what moves men to war. And there was someone who was actually an ROTC instructor who was telling me about Clausewitz's triad, where passion is an essential part, an essential component of the war machine. So this is the kind of thing that has been happening, which is very useful. And there's an experience, it is very familiar, because of course you step into a classroom and you talk. Or this morning, for instance, here, it was a great pleasure to have a small class to talk to around the table. It was relaxed and comfortable, there were questions, things went back and forth. It was very satisfying and very comfortable. At the same time, the visits are very intense. So you move from one event to another, from museum visit, which is, this was again very interesting and pleasurable this morning, and then you meet with students, and then you give a class, and then you go to lunch, and then you meet with docents, and then you give a lecture. So it's like a deep immersion in what is basically, yes, your culture, but the institutions are all different. So it's, it's quite intense, and it's also, I think, a test of stamina in some ways. I don't really have the right kind of information in my fingertips. From talking to people, especially now that I've been going around various institutions as a Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar, I do hear that from my colleagues, that there is a great deal of emphasis on pre-professional training, and so the core classes in liberal education are still there, but there is less interest in them. Yes, I do have a general sense that there is a slight decrease. But then I've always been in classics and classical archaeology, and those are disciplines that have had a sense of crisis for a long time, in some institutions especially. When things become tight and budgets tighten up, we are the first to be looked at for cuts. This is true. And that is true, I think, less in the United States than it is, for instance, in Great Britain, when this is happening more and more. That's something I have never doubted and I've never questioned since I started on this road, that the study of the past is important simply because it is knowledge of what has happened, and what has happened continues to shape the world you live in. So we're very quick to note how things move on, how the world has radically changed by this and that and the other, and we tend to ignore deep-seated patterns that have been constants for centuries, if not millennia. So to give just one very trivial example, when at the beginning of this century, the 21st century, there was a great deal of talk in the papers as this is the American century and the American empire, well, I wonder how many people realize that this cliche of the succession of empires on the stage of universal history goes back 2,500 years. So one could look at it that way, but basically, so far as I'm concerned, what really drives me in a real sense as an archaeologist is the sense of the hunt. You have a trace, you have something that is an artifact or the trace of an action that has taken place in the past, and you want to know what it is, how to understand it, but you also want to sort of retrace the network of connections it has to the culture, to the history, to the people who did it, in a sense, sort of history from the ground up. And that has very little to do with the relevance that it might have to the modern world. That is to say, yes, I do worry about that, and I do think one should be really profoundly engaged with contemporary intellectual discussions and methodology. But ultimately, once I'm in a project, that's all that drives me. Not a good answer, I know, but that's the way it is. Tonight I'll be talking precisely about, and that's precisely the terms in which I'll put it, it's a trace. I'll be talking about a famous monument that was dedicated in a major sanctuary in Greece, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. And in trying to understand it and to see what relevance it had to the, it's very poorly understood, it's very famous, but not very well understood. So I'm going to try to explain why it was appropriate as a dedication to Apollo. I'm going to try to explain why it was a good thing for the Athenians who dedicated it to Apollo to do, and where it fits in the precise historical moment in which it was dedicated. So it's a very, in a sense, it's a very specialized kind of lecture to be given to a general public. But it seems to go over in a way, as a case study of what it is that we do, and that I think is one of the things that the Phi Beta Kappa program intends us to do. That is, we're not, we're going to be ourselves and to present what we do in a way that is understandable, but not necessarily simplified. I think undergraduates in the United States have many choices, so they can set out in a liberal studies tradition and then handsomely go on to medical school, and that background will serve them very well throughout their lives. Students who want to go on to an academic career or career scholars, that is, I think, the only advice for them really, because it is so difficult a path for many reasons, is to choose something that they really love doing, because that's what is going to keep them working, and it's going to eventually make them successful. And it's a very Pollyannish view, but there is no convenience in becoming a historian unless you really love what you do. And